Of all the enduring mysteries that echo from the ancient world, none captivates the imagination quite like the fate of the lost tribes of Israel. It is a story that begins with a united family and ends in a profound and seemingly permanent scattering, a historical puzzle that has launched countless expeditions, inspired epic theories, and fueled the hopes and identities of peoples across the globe for nearly 3 millennia. The very phrase, the lost tribes, conjures images of a vanished people, a hidden kingdom, a forgotten history waiting to be rediscovered. It is an enigma wrapped in prophecy, a demographic cliffhanger on a biblical scale. To understand this mystery, we must first travel back in time, to the very foundation of the nation of Israel, to a single patriarch named Jacob, whose name was changed by God to Israel, meaning he who strives with God. He had 12 sons, and from these 12 sons sprang the 12 tribes that would form a great nation. For centuries, these tribes, a family of families, journeyed together through the wilderness, conquered a promised land, and were ruled by a series of charismatic judges. They reached the zenith of their power and unity under a monarchy, under the reigns of King David and his son, the wise King Solomon, who built a magnificent temple to God in their capital city, Jerusalem. This was the Golden Age, a brief and shining moment when the 12 tribes lived as one, a united kingdom under one God and one king. But this unity, forged in covenant and conquest, was to be tragically short-lived. Following the death of Solomon, the kingdom fractured under the weight of political discontent and spiritual compromise. The nation was ripped in two, creating a great schism that would alter the course of history forever. The two tribes in the south, Judah and Benjamin, remained loyal to Solomon's heir and became the southern kingdom of Judah, with Jerusalem as its heart. The 10 tribes to the north, however, rebelled and formed their own separate nation, the northern kingdom of Israel. For 2 centuries, these two brother kingdoms existed side by side, often as rivals, their shared history poisoned by political division and, in the north, a growing spiritual drift. Then, in the 8th century before the Christian era, a storm gathered in the east. The brutal and relentless Assyrian Empire, a military machine of unparalleled ferocity, swept across the ancient Near East, conquering everything in its path. Around the year 722 BCE, the Assyrians descended upon the northern kingdom of Israel. They laid siege to its capital, Samaria, and after a desperate struggle, the city fell. The kingdom was no more, but the Assyrians were not content merely with conquest. They had a deliberate and cruel policy for ensuring that a conquered nation would never rise again: mass deportation. They rounded up a vast portion of the population of the 10 northern tribes, the leaders, the artisans, the soldiers, the families, and forcibly marched them out of their ancestral homeland. The biblical record tells us they were settled in the distant reaches of the Assyrian Empire, in places with exotic names like Hala, Habor, and the cities of the Medes. And then, from the pages of secular and biblical history, they seem to vanish. They walk off the stage, and the spotlight follows their southern brethren, the Jews of Judah, whose own story of exile and return would come to define the future of the Israelite people. But what of the 10 tribes? What became of the millions of people from the tribes of Reuben, Simeon, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Ephraim, and Manasseh? Did they simply assimilate and disappear into the great melting pot of the ancient world? Did they migrate to some remote, hidden corner of the earth, preserving their identity in secret? Or is their fate something else entirely? A story written not in the annals of human history, but in the unfolding scroll of divine prophecy? This is the question that has haunted historians, theologians, adventurers, and mystics for centuries. It is a quest that leads us through ancient texts and modern genetics, from the mountains of Afghanistan to the jungles of Africa, from the plains of North America to the islands of Japan. It is a story of identity, of hope, of dispersion, and of the profound and persistent belief in a final, promised restoration. To begin our journey, we must go back to the source, to the family of Jacob, and understand the unique identities of the very tribes who were destined to be lost. To truly grasp the magnitude of what was lost, we must first appreciate the intricate and deeply personal origins of the 12 tribes of Israel. The story is not one of abstract demographics, but of a family drama rich with love, jealousy, struggle, and divine purpose. It all begins with the patriarch Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, the man with whom God had first made a covenant to create a great nation. Jacob's life was one of striving with his twin brother Esau, striving with his father-in-law Laban, and most famously, striving with a divine being in a mysterious nighttime wrestling match, after which he was given the name Israel. It was this complex, flawed, and determined man who would become the father of a nation. Through his two wives, the sisters Leah and Rachel, and their two handmaids, Bilhah and Zilpah, Jacob fathered 12 sons. Each son's birth is recorded in the book of Genesis, often accompanied by a story explaining the meaning of his name, reflecting the emotions and struggles of his mother. Leah, the less favored wife, gave Jacob his first 4 sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. The names she chose reflect her yearning for her husband's love. Then, Rachel's handmaid Bilhah bore 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali. Leah's handmaid Zilpah followed with Gad and Asher. Leah herself then bore 2 more sons, Issachar and Zebulun. Finally, Rachel, Jacob's beloved but long barren wife, gave birth to the son she had prayed for, Joseph. Years later, tragically, she died while giving birth to Jacob's 12th and youngest son, Benjamin. These 12 men were the progenitors of the 12 tribes. Their descendants, the Bnei Israel, or children of Israel, carried their names and, to some extent, their characters, down through history. After a dramatic series of events that saw Joseph sold into slavery by his jealous brothers, only to rise to become the vizier of Egypt, the entire family relocated to Egypt to escape a famine. There, they multiplied and grew into a vast people. It was during their enslavement in Egypt that their tribal identities solidified. Before his death, Jacob gathered his 12 sons and gave each a prophetic blessing, a poetic and often enigmatic pronouncement that foretold the future character and destiny of their descendant tribes. Judah was likened to a lion's cub, destined for kingship. Zebulun would dwell by the seashore. Dan would be a serpent by the way. Joseph was a fruitful bough, whose descendants would be blessed. These blessings became foundational to each tribe's self-understanding. When God called Moses to lead the people out of Egypt, he organized them for their journey and for battle according to their tribes, each with its own banner and its own prince. A significant adjustment was made to the tribal structure at this time. The tribe of Joseph, due to his prominence and Jacob's special blessing on his 2 sons, was divided into 2 full tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. This would have made 13 tribes, but the tribe of Levi, from which Moses and his brother Aaron descended, was set apart for a special purpose. The Levites were consecrated for a priestly service in the tabernacle and later the temple. They were not given a contiguous territory of their own. Instead, they were scattered in cities throughout the other tribes' territories, serving as their teachers and spiritual guides. Thus, the number of landholding tribes remained 12. After 40 years in the wilderness, under the leadership of Joshua, the 12 tribes conquered the land of Canaan, the land promised to Abraham centuries before. The land was then meticulously divided and allocated by lot, with each tribe receiving its own inheritance, its own geographical territory where it could put down roots and flourish. For several centuries, during the period of the Judges, they existed as a loose tribal confederacy, often acting independently but uniting under a charismatic leader in times of national crisis. This was the foundational structure of Israelite society, a nation that was a single family, yet also a collection of distinct clans, each with its own land, its own traditions, and its own identity, all bound together by a shared history and a common covenant with their God, Yahweh. It was this rich, complex, and sometimes fragile tapestry that would be torn in two, and whose larger portion would eventually be cut from the loom of history and seemingly lost forever. The golden age of the United Monarchy, a period of unprecedented strength, wealth, and stability under Kings David and Solomon, concealed deep-seated fissures that ran along the ancient tribal fault lines. The unity, while impressive, was in many ways a top-down phenomenon, centered on the powerful personality of David and the administrative genius of Solomon. The southern tribe of Judah, from which David hailed, naturally held a position of prominence, and the centralizing of both political and religious power in Jerusalem, located within Judah's territory, created a growing sense of alienation among the more populous and powerful tribes of the north. The seeds of discontent were sown during Solomon's reign. While his wisdom was legendary and his building projects, including the magnificent First Temple, were the glory of the nation, they came at a tremendous cost. To fund his lavish court and ambitious construction, Solomon imposed heavy taxes and, most grievously, instituted a system of forced labor, the corvée. Men from all the tribes were conscripted for months at a time to work on state projects. This policy was deeply resented, evoking the bitter memory of their enslavement in Egypt. The northern tribes, in particular, felt that they bore a disproportionate share of this burden, while the benefits flowed primarily to the south. When Solomon died, the simmering resentment boiled over. His son and successor, Rehoboam, traveled to the northern city of Shechem to have his kingship affirmed by the northern tribal elders. They came to him with a simple and reasonable request: lighten the harsh policies of your father, and we will serve you faithfully. It was a critical moment, a chance to heal the growing divide and reunify the kingdom through compassion and wisdom. The older, more experienced advisors counseled Rehoboam to agree, but he foolishly rejected their advice. Instead, he listened to his young, arrogant peers and delivered a reply dripping with contempt and menace. My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. This single, disastrous speech was the spark that ignited the revolution. The 10 northern tribes, led by an able and charismatic political dissident named Jeroboam from the tribe of Ephraim, who had previously fled from Solomon's wrath, immediately renounced their allegiance to the house of David. Their cry of rebellion echoed an ancient tribal slogan of independence. What portion have we in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. The schism was swift and absolute. The 10 tribes, Reuben, Simeon, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, and the 2 powerful Joseph tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, formed a new, independent kingdom. They retained the name Israel, seeing themselves as the true heirs of the patriarch's legacy. Jeroboam became their first king. Only the southern tribes of Judah and the smaller, adjacent tribe of Benjamin remained loyal to Rehoboam, forming the southern kingdom, which became known simply as Judah. Jeroboam understood that this political separation would not last if his people continued to be drawn to Jerusalem for the major religious festivals at Solomon's temple. To consolidate his power and create a complete break, he committed an act that the biblical writers would forever condemn as the foundational sin of the northern kingdom. He established 2 new national religious shrines at the northern and southern extremities of his kingdom, in Dan and Bethel. And in each shrine, he erected a golden calf, not necessarily as a new god, but as a visible pedestal or throne for the invisible Yahweh, a tangible focal point for worship. To the people, he declared, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt." He also appointed a new priesthood from outside the consecrated tribe of Levi and established new religious festivals. This act of religious schism was the final seal on the division. From that moment on, the 2 kingdoms would walk separate paths, their destinies diverging, with the northern kingdom embarking on a tumultuous journey that would ultimately lead to its conquest, its exile, and its mysterious disappearance from the world stage. The 2 centuries following the Great Schism were a period of chronic instability and spiritual decline for the northern kingdom of Israel. While the southern kingdom of Judah retained a measure of stability through the continuity of the Davidic dynasty and the centralizing religious authority of the Jerusalem temple, the north was plagued by a relentless cycle of political intrigue, violent coups, and religious apostasy. The precedent set by Jeroboam, who was himself a usurper, established a pattern. Of the 19 kings who ruled over the northern kingdom from 9 different dynasties, 8 were assassinated by their successors. The kingdom was in a near constant state of turmoil, lurching from one ruler to the next, unable to establish the kind of long-term stability that fosters a strong national identity. The biblical narrative, as recorded in the books of Kings and Chronicles, presents this history through a stark theological lens. The primary metric for judging each king was his faithfulness to the covenant with Yahweh. And by this standard, every single one of the 19 kings of Israel failed. The refrain repeated with damning regularity is that each new king walked in the way of Jeroboam and in his sin which he made Israel to sin. The original sin of the golden calves at Dan and Bethel was never expunged. Instead, it became the foundation for an ever-deepening slide into idolatry and syncretism. The most notorious period of this spiritual decay occurred during the reign of King Ahab and his foreign queen, Jezebel, a princess from the Phoenician city of Tyre. Jezebel was a fervent worshiper of her native god, Baal, a Canaanite deity of storm and fertility. She aggressively promoted Baal worship as the state religion in Israel, building a great temple to Baal in the capital city of Samaria and persecuting the prophets of Yahweh. This precipitated a titanic spiritual struggle, personified by the dramatic ministry of the prophet Elijah. The famous contest on Mount Carmel, where Elijah challenged the 450 prophets of Baal to a divine showdown, was a battle for the very soul of the nation. Elijah and his successor Elisha performed mighty miracles and spoke truth to power, representing a courageous minority who remained faithful to Yahweh in a sea of apostasy. Later, in the 8th century BCE, as the kingdom enjoyed a period of material prosperity but suffered from deep social injustice, God raised up other prophets to deliver a searing critique. The shepherd prophet Amos, a southerner from Judah, traveled north to pronounce a message of judgment against the elite of Israel. He condemned their oppression of the poor, their corrupt legal system, and their empty, hypocritical religious festivals. He warned that their prosperity was a prelude to disaster and that a foreign nation would soon carry them into exile. The prophet Hosea used the powerful and painful metaphor of his own marriage to an unfaithful wife to illustrate Israel's spiritual adultery and its violation of its covenant relationship with God. Yet, even in his pronouncements of judgment, Hosea spoke of God's deep, heartbroken love for his wayward people and held out a distant hope for eventual reconciliation. Despite these powerful prophetic warnings, the kingdom as a whole did not repent. The syncretistic worship, blending elements of Yahweh worship with the rituals and deities of their Canaanite neighbors, became deeply entrenched. From a purely historical perspective, this religious drift, combined with the kingdom's inherent political volatility, fatally weakened the nation. It eroded the unique cultural and religious identity that had once bound the 12 tribes together. When the Assyrian storm finally broke upon them, they were a nation divided against itself and divorced from its spiritual foundations, ripe for conquest and dissolution. Their identity was already becoming diluted and fragile, making the subsequent process of assimilation and exile all the more likely, and their eventual disappearance all the more complete. By the middle of the 8th century BCE, the political landscape of the ancient Near East was dominated by a single, terrifying superpower, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. From their heartland in northern Mesopotamia, the Assyrians forged an empire through a combination of brilliant military strategy, advanced siege technology, and a calculated policy of extreme brutality designed to terrorize their enemies into submission. Their royal inscriptions and palace reliefs boast of their conquests, vividly depicting impaled prisoners, flayed enemies, and mountains of severed heads. For the small kingdoms of the Levant, like Israel and Judah, Assyria was an existential threat, a looming storm cloud that threatened to extinguish their very existence. A key component of Assyrian imperial policy, perfected under rulers like Tiglath-Pileser III, was the practice of mass deportation. When they conquered a territory, they did not merely subjugate the local population. They systematically uprooted a large percentage of it, particularly the ruling class, the wealthy, the scribes, the priests, and the skilled artisans, and resettle them in other, distant parts of the empire. At the same time, they would bring conquered peoples from elsewhere and settle them in the newly emptied lands. This was a sophisticated and highly effective strategy of social engineering. Its purpose was threefold. First, to break the will and national identity of the conquered people by severing their connection to their ancestral land, their temples, and their sacred places. Second, to prevent future rebellions by removing the native leadership and creating a mixed, dislocated population with no shared history or allegiance. And third, to provide skilled labor for the Assyrian heartland and to garrison newly conquered frontiers. It was this well-honed imperial machine that turned its attention to the northern kingdom of Israel. The process of conquest was not a single event, but a series of campaigns over several decades. As early as 734 BC, Tiglath-Pileser III invaded Israel, seized large swaths of its northern territories, the lands of the tribes of Naphtali, Zebulun, and Asher, and, according to both his own records and the Bible, carried away their inhabitants into exile. This was the first wave of deportation, a grim foreshadowing of what was to come. The final act began when Hoshea, the last king of Israel, attempted to break free from Assyrian vassalage by forging an alliance with Egypt. The Assyrian king, Shalmaneser V, responded with overwhelming force, invading what was left of the kingdom and laying siege to the heavily fortified capital city of Samaria. The siege was a long and brutal affair, lasting for 3 years. The city finally fell around 722 BC, likely to Shalmaneser's successor, the powerful Sargon II, who boasted in his royal annals of his victory. He claimed to have captured the city and deported 27,290 of its inhabitants. The biblical account in 2 Kings, chapter 17, describes the event in stark, theological terms, and the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites away to Assyria and placed them in Hala and on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. The passage goes on to provide a detailed explanation for this catastrophe, framing it as divine judgment for centuries of idolatry and disobedience, for forsaking the commandments of their God and worshiping the false deities of the nations around them. This was the seminal event, the Great Vanishing Act. A nation was dismembered, its people scooped out of their homeland and scattered across a vast and hostile empire. The names of their places of exile, Hala, Habor, Gozan, the cities of the Medes, are the last concrete geographical markers we have for them in the historical record. They were now a displaced people, subjects of a brutal regime, hundreds of miles from the hills and valleys that had been their home for centuries. The question that hangs over history is what happened next. Did they maintain their identity in this foreign environment, hoping for a return? Or did the Assyrian strategy work exactly as planned, causing them to slowly, inexorably, fade into the diverse tapestry of the empire, their unique heritage dissolving like salt in water? The Assyrian conquest did not just result in the removal of the Israelites, it also led to a radical transformation of the land they left behind. The northern kingdom was not simply left vacant. In accordance with their standard imperial policy, the Assyrians immediately began the process of resettlement, turning the former kingdom of Israel into an Assyrian province with its capital at Samaria. Sargon II and his successors brought in diverse groups of people from other conquered regions of their vast empire and forcibly settled them in the depopulated cities and farmlands of the north. The Bible, in 2 Kings 17, provides a specific list of the places from which these new colonists were drawn, and the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the people of Israel. These new inhabitants, a mosaic of different ethnicities, cultures, and languages, found themselves in a land that was unfamiliar to them. According to the biblical account, they initially continued to worship their own native deities. However, when they were beset by lions, they interpreted it as a sign that the local god of the land was angry. In an appeal to the Assyrian king, they requested a priest of the exiled Israelites to be sent back to teach them the proper way to worship the native deity. The king complied, and an Israelite priest returned to teach them about Yahweh. What resulted was not a conversion, but a fusion. The new inhabitants incorporated the worship of Yahweh into their existing pantheon of gods. The biblical author describes this syncretism with disdain. So they feared the Lord but also served their own gods. This mixed population, a blend of foreign colonists and the Israelites who had not been important enough to be exiled, the poor farmers and laborers, often referred to as the people of the land, gradually intermarried and coalesced over the centuries into a new people, the Samaritans. They viewed themselves as the true heirs of the northern kingdom, the descendants of the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh who had never left their ancestral home. They developed their own distinct version of the Israelite religion. They accepted only the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, the Torah of Moses, as scripture, rejecting the writings of the prophets and other historical books that became part of the Jewish canon. Their holiest site was not Mount Zion in Jerusalem, but Mount Gerizim, an ancient and sacred mountain near Shechem, where they built their own temple to Yahweh. The development of this new Samaritan identity is crucial to understanding why the 10 tribes are considered lost. From the perspective of the southern kingdom of Judah, the people of the north were no longer pure Israelites. They saw them as a mongrel race, a mixed multitude whose bloodlines were tainted and whose religion was a corrupt, paganized version of the true faith. This created a deep and lasting animosity between the two groups. When the Jews later returned from their own exile in Babylon and began to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, they famously rebuffed an offer of help from the Samaritans, further cementing the division. This animosity is palpable centuries later in the New Testament, where Jews are recorded as having no dealings with Samaritans. Therefore, the loss of the 10 tribes was a twofold process. First, there was the physical loss of the deported population who were scattered in the east. Second, there was the perceived loss of identity of those who remained behind, who, in the eyes of their southern brethren, had ceased to be true Israelites. This narrative, whether historically precise in all its details or not, became the accepted reality. It explains why the historical focus shifted so completely to Judah. In the minds of the biblical writers and subsequent generations of Jews, the northern tribes, both those in exile and those who remained, had been effectively written out of the covenant story due to conquest and assimilation. They were lost not just geographically, but also genealogically and theologically. While the historical books of the Old Testament, such as 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, effectively closed the book on the 10 northern tribes after their exile, the story is far from over in the prophetic literature. As the narrative focus shifts entirely to the southern kingdom of Judah, its struggles, its own eventual exile to Babylon, and its partial return, the prophets steadfastly refuse to forget the northern brethren. In fact, a central and recurring theme in the writings of the great prophets is the firm belief and promise that one day, God will regather the scattered exiles of both houses of Israel and reunite them as one people in their own land. This prophetic hope serves as a theological counter-narrative to the apparent historical reality of their disappearance. It insists that while the tribes may be lost to human sight, they are not lost to God. The prophet Isaiah, speaking in the 8th century BC around the very time of the Assyrian conquest, spoke of a future day when God would assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather the dispersed of Judah from the 4 corners of the earth. Isaiah 11 verse 12. He specifically prophesied an end to the long-standing jealousy and rivalry between the two kingdoms. The jealousy of Ephraim shall depart, and those who harass Judah shall be cut off. Ephraim shall not be jealous of Judah, and Judah shall not harass Ephraim. Isaiah 11 verse 13. A century later, the prophet Jeremiah, ministering to Judah in the lead-up to their own Babylonian exile, also spoke powerful words of hope for the northern exiles, often referring to them by the name of their leading tribe, Ephraim. In a tender passage, Jeremiah speaks from God's perspective. I have heard Ephraim grieving. Is Ephraim my dear son? Is he my darling child? For as often as I speak against him, I do remember him still. Therefore my heart yearns for him. I will surely have mercy on him. Jeremiah 31 verses 18 and 20. Jeremiah prophesies a joyous return for both kingdoms, a new covenant that God will make not just with the house of Judah, but with the house of Israel as well. Perhaps the most vivid and dramatic prophecy of reunification comes from the prophet Ezekiel, who ministered to the Jewish exiles in Babylon in the 6th century BC. God commanded Ezekiel to perform a powerful symbolic act. He was to take 2 sticks. On one, he was to write, "For Judah and the people of Israel associated with him." On the other, he was to write, "For Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and all the house of Israel associated with him." Then he was to join them together into a single stick in his hand. God explains the meaning of this sign. "Behold, I am about to take the stick of Joseph, and I will put it with the stick of Judah, and make them one stick, and they shall be one in my hand. I will make them one nation in the land, on the mountains of Israel. And one king shall be king over them all, and they shall be no longer 2 nations, and no longer divided into 2 kingdoms." Ezekiel 37 verses 19 to 22. This vision is an unambiguous promise that the division that began with Rehoboam and Jeroboam is not permanent. In God's ultimate plan of restoration, the schism will be healed. This prophetic consensus was so strong that it carried forward into the time of the New Testament. The idea of the 12 tribes as a single, though scattered, entity was still very much alive. The Apostle Paul, making his defense before King Agrippa, speaks of the hope to which our 12 tribes hope to attain as they earnestly worship night and day. Acts 26 verse 7. The Apostle James addresses his letter to the 12 tribes who are in the dispersion, James 1 verse 1. The book of Revelation culminates in a vision of the New Jerusalem, a celestial city with 12 gates, and inscribed on the gates are the names of the 12 tribes of Israel, Revelation 21 verse 12. These prophetic and apostolic texts firmly establish a crucial theological principle. The story of the 10 tribes does not end in assimilation in Assyria. Their historical disappearance is seen as a temporary state of affairs. Their ultimate destiny, from a biblical perspective, is not to be lost, but to be found, gathered, and reunited in a final, glorious act of divine restoration. This hope became the seedbed from which countless theories about their whereabouts and identity would spring. As the centuries passed after the Assyrian exile, and the 10 tribes did not reappear on the stage of history, a body of literature emerged that attempted to fill in the narrative gaps. This literature, known as the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, includes books written by Jewish authors during the Second Temple period that were not ultimately included in the canon of the Hebrew Bible. While not considered divinely inspired scripture by mainstream Judaism or Protestant Christianity, these texts provide invaluable insight into the beliefs and speculations of the time. Among these writings, one particular account of the lost tribe's fate rose to prominence and became profoundly influential for all subsequent theories. This is the story found in the book of 2 Esdras, also known as 4 Ezra, which was likely written in the late 1st century CE. In chapter 13, the author, Esdras, has a vision of a peaceful man rising from the sea, who is then beset by a hostile multitude. An angelic interpreter explains the vision, and in the course of the explanation, provides a detailed narrative of what happened to the 10 tribes after their deportation by the Assyrians. According to this account, the exiled tribes did not simply settle down and assimilate in the lands of their captivity. Instead, they made a momentous and secret decision. They resolved to leave the pagan lands of the Assyrian Empire, described as the multitude of the nations, and to journey to a distant, unknown land where no human beings had ever lived. Their goal was to find a place where they could faithfully keep the laws of Moses, which they had failed to do in their own land. This land was given a mysterious and evocative name, Arzareth. The text describes their journey as a second Exodus, a miraculous migration of epic proportions. They traveled until they reached the Euphrates River. There, God performed a miracle for them reminiscent of the parting of the Red Sea and the Jordan River. He held back the waters of the river, allowing them to pass through on dry ground. The journey to Arzareth was incredibly long, taking a year and a half. This vast distance and the miraculous crossing served to isolate them completely from the rest of the known world, placing them in a hidden sanctuary where they could live and worship in purity, awaiting the end times. The story in 2 Esdras concludes with a prophecy that at the end of days, God will once again perform the miracle of holding back the Euphrates, allowing them to return from their long exile to be reunited with their brethren. The significance of this narrative cannot be overstated. It provided, for the first time, a detailed and compelling answer to the question of what happened to the tribes. It countered the likely but mundane explanation of assimilation with a romantic and theologically satisfying alternative. It suggested that the tribes were not lost in the sense of being absorbed, but were instead hidden, preserved by God in a remote corner of the earth. The name Arzareth itself, likely derived from the Hebrew Eretz Akret, meaning another land, became a code word for this mythical sanctuary. The legend of two Esdras planted a powerful seed in the collective imagination. It created the paradigm of a mass migration to an unknown continent, a secret kingdom of righteous Israelites waiting in the wings of history. This single, non-canonical story became the blueprint for centuries of speculation. It fueled the belief that the lost tribes could be found if one just looked far enough, in the unexplored regions beyond the known map. Every time a new continent or a new people was discovered, the legend of Arzareth provided a ready-made framework for identifying them as the long-lost brethren. It is the literary ancestor of nearly every theory that would follow, from the Israelitish Native Americans to the tribes of Africa and Asia. It transformed the historical problem of the tribes' disappearance into an eschatological quest for their rediscovery. Beyond the imaginative narratives of apocryphal literature, more sober historical and rabbinic sources from the late Second Temple and early rabbinic periods also grappled with the mystery of the 10 tribes. While they lacked the fantastical detail of two Esdras, these sources confirm that the tribes were not considered extinct in antiquity, but rather geographically distant and existing in a state of separation. The most important historical voice from this era is Flavius Josephus, the first-century Jewish priest and historian who chronicled the history of his people for a Roman audience. In his work Antiquities of the Jews, written in the late 1st century CE, Josephus makes a clear and unambiguous statement about the status of the 10 tribes in his own day. He writes, "The entire body of the people of Israel remained in that country, Babylonia, wherefore there are but 2 tribes in Asia and Europe subject to the Romans, while the 10 tribes are beyond the Euphrates till now, and are an immense multitude, and not to be estimated by numbers." This is a remarkable assertion. Josephus, a well-traveled and well-informed historian, treats it as common knowledge that the 10 tribes were not lost at all. In his view, they were simply located outside the borders of the Roman Empire, in the vast territory of the Parthian Empire east of the Euphrates River. He describes them not as a scattered remnant, but as an immense multitude, suggesting a thriving and populous community. Josephus's testimony implies that in the 1st century, the primary distinction was not between Jews and lost Israelites, but between the Israelites within the Roman Empire, the 2 tribes, and the Israelites outside of it, the 10 tribes. They were separated by a political boundary, not an ontological one. They were inaccessible, but not non-existent. While Josephus provides a geographical location, the early rabbinic sages, whose discussions are recorded in the Talmud and the Midrash, debated the ultimate fate and spiritual status of the tribes. There was no single, universally accepted opinion, and the rabbis explored a spectrum of possibilities. On the more pessimistic end of the spectrum was the famous Rabbi Akiva, a prominent 2nd century sage. He is quoted in the Mishnah as stating that the 10 tribes are not destined to return, citing a verse from Deuteronomy about a land from which the people are cast out into another land, as it is this day. Rabbi Akiva interpreted this to mean a permanent exile, a one-way journey from which there was no coming back. However, this was a minority opinion. A more common and hopeful view, articulated by other sages like Rabbi Eliezer, was that the tribes would indeed return. He compared their exile to a day that grows dark and then light again, suggesting that their current state of darkness would be followed by a future dawn of redemption. The rabbis often cited the great prophetic promises of restoration from Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel as proof that God would not abandon a portion of his people forever. They debated the specifics. Would all individuals return, or only the righteous among them? Would they return before the coming of the Messiah, or would the Messiah himself be the one to gather them? These ancient debates reveal that the mystery of the 10 tribes was as potent for the founders of Rabbinic Judaism as it is for us today. They had access to traditions and sources that have since been lost, yet even they could not arrive at a definitive consensus. They affirmed two central points. First, that a significant portion of their people existed beyond the Euphrates, cut off from the main body of Judaism centered in Judea and later in Babylon. And second, that the prophetic hope for an eventual reunification of all 12 tribes was a core component of their eschatological vision. The question for them, as it is for many today, was how and when this great reunion would come to pass. As the ancient world gave way to the medieval period, the question of the lost tribes shifted from a subject of theological debate to one of intense and practical interest. For the Jewish communities scattered across the Christian and Islamic worlds, often living as a small and persecuted minority, the idea that a powerful, independent kingdom of their brethren existed somewhere beyond the known horizon was a source of profound hope and psychological comfort. The search for the lost tribes became a recurring theme in the accounts of medieval Jewish travelers, blending verifiable geography with legendary tales. The most dramatic and influential of these accounts came from a mysterious 9th century traveler named Eldad, who claimed to be from the tribe of Dan. Eldad the Danite, as he became known, appeared suddenly in the Jewish communities of North Africa and the Middle East with an extraordinary story. He claimed that the tribes of Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher had established a mighty and independent kingdom in the land of Havilah, a semi-mythical location often identified with parts of Africa or Arabia. He described this kingdom in vivid detail, ruled by a powerful king, with a great army, and adhering strictly to Jewish law. He also spoke of other tribes like the tribe of Issachar living in the mountains and the tribe of Zebulun living by the sea. Most fantastically, he spoke of the sons of Moses, a righteous and holy tribe of Levites who lived in complete isolation, surrounded by a legendary, impassable river of stones called the Sambation, which raged with a torrent of rocks and sand for 6 days of the week and rested only on the Sabbath, making it impossible to cross. Eldad's stories, which included details about the unique legal customs and Hebrew dialect of his people, were met with a mixture of excitement and skepticism. The rabbinic leaders of the time questioned him intensely, but his tales were so compelling that they were widely circulated and largely accepted. Whether Eldad was a genuine representative of a remote Jewish community, a masterful storyteller, or something in between, his narrative had a powerful impact. It provided a tangible, almost believable vision of the lost tribes not as a scattered, assimilated remnant, but as a thriving and powerful nation, a testament to God's faithfulness. 3 centuries later, a more reliable and historically valuable account came from the great 12th century traveler, Benjamin of Tudela. A Spanish rabbi, Benjamin embarked on a remarkable journey that took him through Europe, the Byzantine Empire, and deep into the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate. His meticulously recorded itinerary provides a priceless snapshot of the Jewish world in the 12th century. While Benjamin did not claim to have found the kingdom of the lost tribes, his writings are filled with encounters with communities who were identified with them. He spoke of independent Jewish communities in the mountains of Persia who claimed descent from Dan, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. He reported on rumors of a Jewish king ruling in the deserts of Arabia. Unlike Eldad's fantastical accounts, Benjamin's reports were more grounded, describing real communities and their economic and social conditions. Yet, he too was clearly captivated by the possibility that these remote and often warlike Jewish groups were the remnant of the 10 tribes. These medieval accounts, from the legendary Eldad to the more sober Benjamin, served a crucial purpose. They kept the story of the lost tribes alive, not as a forgotten piece of ancient history, but as a contemporary reality, a living hope. They transformed the biblical promise of restoration into a tangible quest, an invitation to believe that just beyond the horizon, the scattered family of Israel was still vast, powerful, and waiting for the day of reunification. The dawning of the age of exploration in the late 15th and 16th centuries dramatically reshaped the world map and, with it, the landscape of possibilities for the location of the lost tribes. The discovery of the Americas by Europeans introduced a vast, previously unknown hemisphere populated by millions of people with cultures and origins that were a complete mystery. For European thinkers, steeped in a biblical worldview that accounted for the descent of all humanity from the sons of Noah, the existence of these new world peoples posed a significant theological and anthropological problem. A compelling and widely embraced solution quickly emerged. The indigenous peoples of the Americas were the descendants of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. This theory seemed to solve multiple puzzles at once. It provided the Native Americans with a prestigious and biblically sanctioned ancestry, fitting them neatly into the framework of sacred history. It also offered a plausible explanation for where the tribes had gone. The remote and mythical land of Arzareth from 2 Esdras was now given a real-world geographical location, America. Proponents of the theory marshaled a wide array of evidence to support their claims. They pointed to supposed similarities between Native American and ancient Israelite customs. Tribal social structures, the practice of scalping, which was erroneously compared to biblical vows, alleged linguistic cognates between native languages and Hebrew, and religious practices, like the belief in a great spirit or purification rituals, were all cited as proof of an Israelite origin. Early observers, like the Spanish Dominican friar Diego Duran, who worked among the Aztecs in the 16th century, became convinced of the connection, arguing that Aztec rites and traditions were a corrupted form of ancient Jewish rituals. The theory gained significant traction in Protestant Europe, particularly in England. But its most influential and sophisticated advocate was a prominent 17th century Dutch rabbi named Manasseh ben Israel. Manasseh was a respected scholar and diplomat who corresponded with leaders across Europe. His imagination was fired by a sworn testimony from a traveler named Antonio da Montesinos, who claimed to have encountered a group of indigenous people in the mountains of the Andes who recited the Shema, the core Jewish declaration of faith, and identified themselves as being from the tribe of Reuben. In 1650, Manasseh compiled this and other evidence into a highly influential book titled Spes Israelis, or The Hope of Israel. He argued that the scattering of the tribes to the very ends of the earth was a necessary precondition for the coming of the Messiah and the final redemption. The discovery of the tribes in America was, for him, a powerful sign that the Messianic era was at hand. He masterfully used this argument in his political lobbying. He presented his book to the English Parliament and Oliver Cromwell, using it as a key part of his successful campaign to have the Jews, who had been expelled from England in 1290, formally readmitted to the country. He argued that allowing the Jews to settle in England would complete their prophesied scattering and thus hasten the final redemption, which would be a benefit to all of Christendom. The theory that the Native Americans were descended from the lost tribes remained immensely popular for centuries, shaping colonial attitudes and missionary strategies. While it has been definitively disproven by modern genetic, linguistic, and archaeological evidence, its historical impact was profound. It represents one of the most ambitious attempts to map the biblical narrative onto the newly discovered globe and to find in the faces of a new people the long-lost features of the family of Israel. The pervasive and popular theory that the indigenous peoples of the Americas were the descendants of the lost tribes of Israel found its most unique and enduring theological expression in the foundational texts of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The narrative presented in the Book of Mormon, first published in 1830, offers a detailed and dramatic account of an Israelite migration to the Americas, establishing a direct link between the ancient Near East and the civilizations of the pre-Columbian New World. While often conflated with the broader lost tribes theory, the Book of Mormon's account presents a distinct migration event with its own specific timeline and tribal composition. The story begins not in the 8th century BCE with the Assyrian exile of the Northern Kingdom, but around 600 BCE, on the eve of the Babylonian conquest of the southern kingdom of Judah. The central figure is a prophet named Lehi, a resident of Jerusalem who is warned by God in a dream to flee the city's impending destruction. Lehi, along with his family and a few others, embarks on a divinely guided journey through the Arabian Peninsula. The text identifies Lehi as a descendant of the tribe of Manasseh, one of the 2 tribes of Joseph. His group is later joined by the family of a man named Ishmael, who is identified as being from the tribe of Ephraim, the other Joseph tribe. Thus, the core of this migrating group is explicitly linked to the leading tribes of the old northern kingdom, though they are departing from the southern capital of Jerusalem. After a long and arduous journey, the group, known as the Lehites, builds a ship and, guided by a divine compass called the Liahona, sails across the ocean to the Americas, which they call the Promised Land. Once in the New World, however, the family splits into two rival factions due to the rebellion of Lehi's elder sons, Laman and Lemuel, against his righteous younger son, Nephi. This schism gives rise to two great civilizations that will be in a state of near constant conflict for the next 1,000 years. The righteous descendants of Nephi are called the Nephite, while the descendants of Laman and Lemuel are called the Lamanite. For their wickedness, the Lamanite are cursed with a skin of blackness, to distinguish them from the Nephite. The Book of Mormon chronicles the complex history of these two nations, their periods of righteousness and wickedness, their prophets and their wars. The theological climax of the book occurs after Jesus' resurrection. The resurrected Christ appears to the Nephite in the Americas, declares that they are the other sheep he spoke of in the Gospel of John, and delivers a series of sermons very similar to the Sermon on the Mount. He heals their sick, establishes his church among them, and ushers in a 200-year period of peace. Eventually, however, wickedness returns, and the conflict between the two groups culminates in a cataclysmic series of battles in which the dark-skinned Lamanite completely annihilate the Nephite civilization around 400 CE. The central prophet historian, Mormon, and his son Moroni are the last survivors, and they compile and bury the sacred records that Joseph Smith would later claim to have found and translated. The Lamanite, who survived, are identified in Latter-day Saint theology as the principal ancestors of the American Indians. The Book of Mormon's narrative, therefore, provides a comprehensive, if theologically unique, answer to the question of Native American origins. It taps directly into the centuries-old fascination with the lost tribes, but it grounds the story in a new set of revelations, offering a detailed history, a new volume of scripture, and a distinct theological framework that includes a post-resurrection appearance of Christ in the Americas. It represents the most elaborate and influential crystallization of the idea that a branch of the house of Israel was transplanted to the New World, their history and their eventual fate intertwined with the destiny of the American continents. Parallel to the theory that placed the lost tribes in the Americas, another powerful and enduring hypothesis emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries, one that located the tribes not in a remote and primitive land, but at the very heart of modern Western civilization. This is the theory of British Israelism, also known as Anglo-Israelism, which posits that the people of Great Britain, and by extension the Anglo-Saxon peoples of the United States, Canada, Australia, and other Commonwealth nations, are the direct physical descendants of the 10 northern tribes of Israel. This idea, while rejected by virtually all mainstream historians, theologians, and geneticists, developed into a complex system of belief that has had a significant, if often unacknowledged, influence on aspects of British and American religious and national identity. The theory attempts to bridge the 2,700-year gap between the Assyrian exile and the rise of the British Empire by proposing a specific, though historically unsupported, migration route. According to this narrative, the Israelites were not absorbed into the Assyrian population but instead began a long, westward trek over many centuries. They are said to have migrated north from their place of exile, passing through the Caucasus Mountains, a journey from which the term Caucasian is erroneously derived. As they moved across Europe, they were known by various names recorded in classical history, such as the Scythians and the Cimmerians. Adherents of the theory claim that these ancient peoples were not Gentiles, but were in fact the disguised tribes of Israel. Eventually, these tribal groups continued their westward migration, with some becoming the Germanic tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, who would later invade and settle in Britain. Other branches of this migration are said to have formed the Celtic peoples of the British Isles. In this view, the establishment of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in Britain was not a pagan invasion, but the final stage in the prophesied resettlement of the tribes of Israel in a new promised land, the Isles of the Sea, mentioned by the prophet Isaiah. Proponents of British Israelism have compiled a vast and intricate body of proofs to support their claims. These proofs fall into several categories. There are supposed linguistic links, such as the claim that the word Saxon derives from Isaac's sons, or that British comes from the Hebrew words Brit, meaning covenant, and Ish, meaning man, thus identifying the British as the covenant people. They point to heraldry, arguing that the lion and the unicorn on the royal coat of arms of the United Kingdom represent the biblical symbols of the leading tribes of Judah and Joseph, Ephraim, respectively. They find evidence in British place names, monuments like Stonehenge, and aspects of English common law. Above all, they rely on a particular interpretation of biblical prophecy. They believe that the promises of a great and numerous nation, a people who would possess the gates of their enemies and be a blessing to the world, were made specifically to the northern tribes of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, and were not fulfilled by the Jewish people, Judah, but have been fulfilled by the British Empire and the United States. This reinterpretation of Scripture leads to the conclusion that the Anglo-Saxon peoples are God's true chosen people for this age, inheriting the birthright promises that were originally given to the tribes of Joseph. While often dismissed as pseudo-history, British Israelism became a highly organized movement in the 19th and 20th centuries, with numerous publications, organizations, and influential adherents. Its appeal lay in its ability to provide a grand, biblical justification for the rise of the British Empire and the global influence of the English-speaking peoples, framing their political and economic dominance not as a historical accident, but as the fulfillment of divine destiny. It offered a powerful sense of identity, connecting the British people directly to the covenants and promises of the Bible in a way that superseded traditional Christianity. The search for the descendants of the lost tribes has not been confined to the Americas or to Europe. It has been a truly global phenomenon, giving rise to compelling claims from communities in Asia and Africa. Among the most fascinating and persistent of these traditions is that of the Pashtun people, a large and influential ethnic group living primarily in Afghanistan and Pakistan. For centuries, the Pashtun, who are predominantly Muslim, have maintained a strong oral tradition that they are descended from ancient Israelites. They refer to themselves as the Bani Israel, a term remarkably similar to the Hebrew Bnei Israel, meaning children of Israel. Their traditions, first recorded in medieval chronicles, hold that they are descended from King Saul of the tribe of Benjamin, and that after the Assyrian conquest, their Israelite ancestors were exiled to the region of modern-day Afghanistan. This tradition is remarkably detailed and is woven into the very fabric of their tribal identity. Many Pashtun clans and subtribes bear names that are strikingly similar to the names of the Israelite tribes, such as the Yusufzai, sons of Joseph, the Rabbani, sons of Reuben, and the Afridi, possibly from Ephraim. They practice a series of customs, collectively known as Pashtunwali, their traditional code of conduct, which some observers have noted contains intriguing parallels to Mosaic law, such as practices related to dietary restrictions, ritual purity, and the lighting of candles on Friday nights. While mainstream historical and genetic research has not confirmed a definitive link, the Pashtun tradition of Israelite descent is one of the oldest and most widespread claims in the world, a powerful example of a collective memory preserved for millennia. Further south, in Africa, the story of the Beta Israel of Ethiopia presents another compelling case. This long-isolated community, practicing a form of pre-rabbinic Judaism, has for centuries held the firm belief that they are descended from the ancient Israelite tribe of Dan. Their tradition states that their ancestors migrated south into Africa either at the time of the Exodus or during the schism of the Israelite kingdom. For centuries, they lived in Ethiopia, often facing persecution, while faithfully observing the Sabbath, dietary laws, and other precepts of the Torah, all without knowledge of the later developments of the Talmud and Rabbinic Judaism. In the 20th century, after extensive rabbinic debate, the chief rabbinate of Israel officially recognized the Beta Israel as descendants of a lost tribe, paving the way for their dramatic airlift to Israel in Operations Moses and Solomon in the 1980s and 90s. Their story represents a rare instance where a claimant group has been formally accepted and reunited with the main body of the Jewish people. In the northeastern corner of India, in the states of Mizoram and Manipur, live a people known as the Bnei Minishi, the children of Manasseh. This group of several thousand people claims that they are the descendants of the tribe of Manasseh, one of the 10 northern tribes. Their oral tradition tells of a long, eastward migration from their place of exile through Persia and China, eventually settling in their current homeland. They have preserved a sacred song that describes the events of the Exodus, the parting of the Red Sea, and the pillar of fire and cloud, all in their native language. Over the past few decades, many of the BNEI Minashi have begun to formally practice Orthodox Judaism, and with the help of private organizations and, more recently, the recognition of a chief rabbi of Israel, several thousand have been allowed to immigrate to Israel, fulfilling what they see as a lifelong dream of returning to their ancestral land. From the Igbo people of Nigeria, many of whom claim Israelite heritage, to communities in Kashmir and Japan with their own local traditions of Israelite origins, the story resonates across cultures. These diverse claims, whether supported by historical evidence or not, demonstrate the profound and enduring power of the lost tribe's narrative to shape identity, to provide a sense of ancient lineage, and to foster a hope of belonging to a larger, sacred story that transcends time and geography. While the myriad theories involving secret kingdoms and epic migrations are captivating, it is essential to step back and consider the consensus view of mainstream academic historians and biblical scholars. From a purely historical and sociological perspective, the fate of the 10 northern tribes is likely far less mysterious and romantic than the legends suggest. The most probable and most mundane explanation for their disappearance is that the vast majority of the exiled Israelites simply did what most conquered and deported peoples have done throughout history. They assimilated. The Assyrian policy of deportation and population exchange was not an arbitrary act of cruelty. It was a highly effective and time-tested tool of imperial control, designed precisely to achieve this outcome. When the Israelites were uprooted from their homeland and scattered in various cities and provinces across the vast Assyrian Empire, they were severed from the very things that had sustained their unique identity. They lost their connection to their ancestral land, the sacred hills and valleys where their history had unfolded. They lost their political structures, their monarchy, and their tribal leadership. They lost their central religious institutions, as they were now hundreds of miles away from the centers of Yahweh worship, whether at Bethel, Dan, or even Jerusalem. They were plunged into a new, cosmopolitan environment, a melting pot of different cultures, languages, and religions. In this new context, the pressures to assimilate would have been immense. For survival and for social and economic advancement, it would have been necessary to learn the dominant languages of the empire, particularly Aramaic, which had become the lingua franca of the region. Intermarriage with the local populations would have been common, and over the course of just a few generations, the distinct Israelite bloodlines would have become diluted. The religious pressures would have been equally strong. Surrounded by the powerful and impressive cults of the Assyrian and later Babylonian gods, and lacking their own organized priesthood and temples, many would have gradually adopted the religious practices of their neighbors. The process would not have been instantaneous or uniform. Some communities likely clung to their Israelite identity and their worship of Yahweh for several generations. It is plausible that small, isolated pockets of Israelite descendants maintained some form of their heritage for a very long time. It is also highly likely that some individuals and families from the north managed to migrate south to the Kingdom of Judah, both before and after the Assyrian conquest, and were absorbed into the population that would eventually become known as the Jews. The Bible itself records that King Hezekiah of Judah sent invitations to the remnants in the north to join in the Passover celebration in Jerusalem, and some responded. However, the key point is that as cohesive, distinct tribal entities, the 10 tribes ceased to exist. They did not migrate en masse to a hidden land. They dissolved. Their genetic and cultural heritage was not erased from the earth, but was instead poured into the great stream of humanity in the ancient Near East. Their descendants became Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, and the many other peoples who inhabited that region. In this view, the tribes are not lost in the sense of being hidden somewhere waiting to be found. They are lost in the sense that their distinct corporate identity was lost to the inexorable historical forces of conquest, exile, and absorption. This explanation may lack the romance of a quest for Arzareth, but it aligns with everything we know about the sociology of empires and the fate of countless other conquered peoples throughout history. In the quest to solve the mystery of the lost tribes, many have turned to the hard sciences of archaeology and genetics, hoping to find concrete, physical evidence that might confirm or deny the various theories. If a large population of Israelites migrated to a new land, they surely would have left behind archaeological traces, pottery, buildings, inscriptions. Likewise, if modern groups are their direct descendants, a clear genetic signature should be detectable in their DNA. However, the scientific evidence, while fascinating, has thus far failed to provide a definitive smoking gun, and, for the most part, tends to support the more mundane historical explanation of assimilation. From an archaeological perspective, the evidence is notable for its absence. There is simply no archaeological evidence to support a mass migration of hundreds of thousands of Israelites to a single, remote location like the mythical Arzareth, or to any of the other proposed destinations, such as the Americas or the British Isles. The civilizations of the pre-Columbian Americas, for example, developed from indigenous roots over thousands of years and show no signs of a sudden influx of people with an Iron Age, Near Eastern material culture. There are no ancient Hebrew inscriptions, no Israelite-style four-room houses, and no artifacts that can be definitively linked to a transoceanic migration from the Levant. The archaeological record in the ancient Near East, on the other hand, strongly supports the biblical and historical accounts of the conquest and its aftermath. Assyrian records and reliefs graphically depict their campaigns in the Levant and their policy of deportation. Excavations in the former territory of the Northern Kingdom have uncovered evidence of the Assyrian destruction, followed by the appearance of new types of pottery and architecture consistent with the settlement of foreign peoples, corroborating the story of the origin of the Samaritans. The field of population genetics offers a more complex and sometimes tantalizing, though ultimately inconclusive, picture. Modern DNA analysis allows scientists to trace paternal, Y chromosome, and maternal, mtDNA, lineages back for centuries, and to compare the genetic makeup of different world populations. This has been used to test the claims of various groups who identify as descendants of the lost tribes. The results have been mixed. For some theories, the evidence is decisively negative. Extensive genetic testing of Native American populations has overwhelmingly shown their ancestry to be from East Asia, stemming from migrations across the Bering Strait thousands of years ago, with no detectable link to ancient Near Eastern populations. Similarly, the populations of Great Britain and Western Europe have genetic profiles rooted in ancient European migrations, not the Near East. For some other claimant groups, however, the results are more intriguing. Studies on the Lemba people of southern Africa, who have a tradition of Israelite origin, have found that a significant percentage of their men carry a Y chromosome marker known as the Cohen modal haplotype, which is particularly common among men who identify as belonging to the Jewish priestly class, the Kohanim. This suggests a plausible, though not definitive, ancestral link to the Middle East. Genetic studies on the Bni-Minishi of India and the Pashtun of Afghanistan have yielded more ambiguous results, with some markers suggesting a possible distant link to the Middle East, while the overall genetic profile is predominantly local. In essence, genetics has not discovered a single, isolated population that could be identified as a lost tribe. Instead, it has painted a picture of a world with complex and sometimes surprising migration patterns. It has supported the idea that some communities may indeed have ancestral roots in the ancient Near East, but it has largely debunked the more grandiose theories of mass migrations to new continents. Science, therefore, tends to confirm the historical likelihood that the tribes were not lost, but absorbed, leaving faint genetic echoes in various populations, rather than a single, clear signal waiting to be found. Perhaps the most significant barrier to solving the mystery of the lost tribes lies in the ambiguity of the central question itself. What does it truly mean for a people to be lost? The answer depends entirely on one's perspective. The very framing of the problem shapes the potential solutions. We can deconstruct the concept of lost into several distinct categories, each leading to a different conclusion. First, we can ask if the tribes are historically lost. In this sense, the answer is an almost unequivocal yes. As distinct, self-governing, and historically visible tribal entities, the 10 northern tribes disappear from the annals of history after the Assyrian conquest. The administrative and historical records of the subsequent empires, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, and Roman, do not mention them. Their collective political and national story comes to an abrupt end. They cease to be actors on the stage of world history, and in that sense, they were well and truly lost. Second, we can ask if they were genealogically lost. This is the question of assimilation. Did their unique genetic heritage disappear? The answer here is more nuanced. It is almost certain that their bloodlines did not vanish, but were instead absorbed into the vast gene pool of the ancient Near East and beyond. Through intermarriage, their DNA became part of the heritage of modern-day Iraqis, Syrians, Kurds, and many other peoples. So, while a distinct and isolated tribe of Asher gene pool no longer exists, the genetic legacy of the people of Asher undoubtedly survives, scattered and blended within countless other populations. They are lost in the sense that a cup of water is lost when it is poured into a lake. Its essence is still there, but it can no longer be identified as a separate entity. Third, there is the idea of being geographically lost. This is the romantic notion championed by 2 Esdras and the subsequent theories, suggesting that the tribes are living together in a cohesive community in some remote, hidden location, awaiting discovery. As we have seen, there is no credible historical, archaeological, or genetic evidence to support this view. While the existence of isolated communities with Israelite roots cannot be entirely ruled out, the idea of the 10 tribes existing as a complete, undiscovered nation is the stuff of legend, not history. A more subtle and significant meaning is that they were relationally lost. They were cut off from the main body of the Israelite people, which after the Assyrian exile became synonymous with the southern kingdom of Judah. It was Judah that endured the Babylonian exile, returned to rebuild the temple, and whose scribes and sages codified the Hebrew Bible and developed the body of law and tradition that would evolve into rabbinic Judaism. The 10 tribes were absent from this entire formative process. They were lost to the ongoing story of their own people, separated from the very community that would carry the name Israel in the form of Jew, derived from Judah, into the future. Finally, and most importantly from a biblical perspective, we must ask if they were theologically lost. Were they lost to God? The Bible's answer to this question is a resounding and unambiguous no. The prophets, as we have seen, consistently speak of them as a people whom God has not forgotten, a people for whom He still has a plan and a purpose. Their lostness is a human perspective, a consequence of their historical circumstances. From the divine perspective, God knows exactly where every descendant of every tribe is. The prophetic promises of a future regathering and reunification insist that in the eyes of God, no one is ever truly or permanently lost. Reframing the question in this way helps to clarify the entire debate. The historical and scientific evidence points toward assimilation, while the theological and prophetic evidence points toward a future restoration. These are not necessarily contradictory. It is possible for a people to be historically and genealogically absorbed, yet for God to still have a plan for their ultimate redemption, however that may manifest in the eschatological future. The true mystery, then, may not be where the tribes went, but how God intends to fulfill His promise to a people who have, by all human measures, disappeared. Out of the complex theological discussions surrounding the ultimate fate of the scattered northern tribes, a particular framework known as two-house theology, or the two-house movement, has gained prominence, especially within Messianic Jewish circles and some branches of Hebraic roots Christianity. This theology proposes that the division of the kingdom into 2 houses, the southern house of Judah and the northern house of Israel, often represented by its leading tribe, Ephraim, is not just a historical footnote but is, in fact, one of the central, unfolding dramas of the entire biblical narrative. It provides a comprehensive, eschatological answer to what happened to the lost tribes by identifying them with a vast, unsuspecting portion of modern global Christianity. The starting point for this theology is the prophetic promises of a future reunification of the 2 divided kingdoms, particularly the powerful imagery of Ezekiel's 2 sticks being joined into one. Two house proponents interpret these prophecies in a very literal and physical sense. They see the entire history of God's people through the lens of this sibling rivalry and eventual reconciliation. In this framework, the two houses were given distinct and separate missions by God. The house of Judah, the Jewish people, was entrusted with preserving the Torah, the covenants, the lineage of King David, and the Holy Scriptures. They were to be the scepter of the kingdom, maintaining a visible, national identity throughout their long exile and providing the lineage through which the Messiah would be born. Their story is one of stubborn preservation of identity against all odds. The house of Israel/Ephraim, on the other hand, had a different destiny. After being exiled by the Assyrians, the 10 northern tribes were, according to this view, deliberately scattered by God among the Gentile nations. The prophet Hosea had prophesied that Israel would be sown among the peoples. Two-house theology interprets this to mean that the tribes did not simply assimilate and disappear, but that their physical descendants were intentionally blended into the nations of the world, particularly the peoples of Europe. They lost their Israelite identity, forgot their heritage, and became, for all intents and purposes, Gentiles. Their mission, albeit an unconscious one, was to carry the seed of Abraham throughout the world. The theological climax of this story comes with the person and work of Jesus, Yeshua. Jesus came first to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. While this is traditionally understood as a mission to the Jewish people of his day, two-house theology interprets it as having a dual meaning, also referring to the physically scattered and unidentified northern tribes. The salvation offered through the Messiah is seen as the mechanism for their eventual regathering. According to this view, when vast numbers of Gentiles from the European nations began to convert to Christianity in the centuries following Jesus' death and resurrection, this was not simply the expansion of the church. It was, in reality, the beginning of the prophesied return of the lost house of Israel. These Gentile Christians, particularly those of European descent, are believed to be the literal, physical descendants of the scattered 10 tribes. They are Ephraim, who, having been divorced from God for their idolatry and having become not a people, are now being brought back into the family through faith in the Jewish Messiah, thereby being grafted back into their own olive tree, as the Apostle Paul describes in Romans 11. In this interpretation, the Christian church is largely composed of the redeemed and re-identified house of Ephraim. The current era is seen as the time when these two long-separated brothers, Judah and Ephraim, are beginning to recognize each other. The rise of Messianic Judaism, Jewish people who believe in Jesus, is seen as Judah reaching out, while the growing interest of many Christians in the Torah and the Jewish roots of their faith is seen as Ephraim beginning to awaken to his true identity. The ultimate fulfillment of prophecy will be the final, spiritual and physical reunification of these two houses into one restored kingdom of all 12 tribes under their king, the Messiah. This theology, while not accepted by mainstream Judaism or Christianity, provides a powerful and all-encompassing answer to the mystery. It suggests the tribes were never truly lost, but were simply hidden within the nations, waiting to be reawakened and reunited with their brother Judah through the gospel. The question of why the story of the lost tribes has exerted such a powerful and enduring grip on the human imagination for over 2,700 years is almost as fascinating as the mystery itself. Its longevity and its ability to adapt to new geographical and cultural contexts speak to a series of deep-seated psychological and spiritual needs. This is not merely a historical puzzle. It is a narrative that touches upon some of the most profound themes of human existence: identity, belonging, loss, and the hope of restoration. At its most basic level, the story appeals to our innate desire for narrative completion. The Bible presents the 12 tribes as a complete family, a perfect and divinely ordained structure. The sudden and unresolved disappearance of 10 of those family members leaves a gaping hole in the story. It is an unfinished chapter, a loose thread in the sacred tapestry, and the human mind abhors an unresolved narrative. The search for the lost tribes is, in part, a quest for closure, an attempt to write the final chapter and restore the integrity of the original family. The narrative also possesses the timeless allure of a great adventure story. Like the legends of Atlantis, El Dorado, or the Fountain of Youth, it is a tale of a hidden world, a lost civilization waiting to be rediscovered. It invites speculation, exploration, and the romance of the unknown. It allows for the possibility that the world is more mysterious and magical than it appears, that a secret kingdom from the Bible might still exist just beyond the edge of the map. This element of mystery has fueled the imaginations of everyone from medieval travelers to modern-day adventurers. Furthermore, the story speaks directly to the fundamental human need for identity and belonging. For the various groups around the world who have claimed descent from the lost tribes, this narrative provides a powerful and prestigious sense of origin. It connects their community directly to the ancient world of the Bible, granting them a lineage that is both noble and sacred. In a world where identities are often fluid and contested, claiming a direct link to the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob provides a bedrock of historical significance and a powerful sense of divine purpose. This is particularly true for communities that have felt marginalized or disconnected from the major currents of world history. For scattered and often persecuted peoples, as the Jews were in the medieval period, the story has served as a powerful source of hope. The belief that somewhere in the world there existed a powerful, free, and independent kingdom of their own brethren was a profound psychological comfort. It was a testament that they were not alone, that their people were still a mighty nation in the eyes of God, and that their present suffering was not the final word. The idea of a hidden remnant provided a powerful counter-narrative to the reality of weakness and oppression. Perhaps most importantly, the story is imbued with immense eschatological significance. For centuries, Jewish and Christian traditions have viewed the final gathering of the scattered tribes as a key sign of the end times, a necessary prelude to the coming of the Messiah and the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. This belief transforms the search for the tribes from a historical curiosity into a matter of ultimate spiritual importance. Their rediscovery is not just about solving a puzzle, it is about participating in the fulfillment of prophecy and hastening the final redemption of the world. This theological weight ensures that the story will continue to be told, debated, and reinterpreted as long as people look to the Bible for clues about the future. In the vast and often speculative search for the vanished northern tribes, it is easy to overlook a crucial fact. One group of people never left the ancestral homeland of the Northern Kingdom, and they have maintained to this very day that they are the true and direct descendants of the ancient Israelites who remained. These are the Samaritans, a small and ancient ethno-religious community who live on and around their holy mountain, Mount Gerizim, near the modern Palestinian city of Nablus, which stands on the site of the ancient Israelite capital of Shechem. The Samaritan perspective offers a powerful and often ignored counter-narrative to the entire mystery of the lost tribes. While the mainstream Jewish and historical account, derived from 2 Kings 17, portrays them as a mixed race descended from foreign colonists and a few Israelite peasants, the Samaritans' own historical tradition is starkly different. They utterly reject this narrative, viewing it as slanderous propaganda written by their ancient rivals in the southern kingdom of Judah. In their own view, they are the Shemrim, the keepers of the true, ancient law and faith of Israel. They claim direct descent from the Israelite tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, the two tribes of Joseph, and from the priestly line of Levi, who were not exiled by the Assyrians. They believe that they have preserved the original Israelite religion in its pure and uncorrupted form, a religion that was later altered and distorted by the Jews of Judah. Their community represents, in their eyes, the faithful remnant of the northern kingdom. The core of the Samaritan faith is centered on 5 key principles. They believe in one God, Yahweh, the God of Israel. They believe in one prophet, Moses, whom they consider to be the greatest prophet who ever lived, superseding all others. They accept only one holy book, the Samaritan Torah, which consists of the first 5 books of Moses. While very similar to the Jewish Torah, it has some significant variations, most notably in its version of the 10 Commandments, where the 10th commandment is to build an altar and worship God on their holy site, Mount Gerizim. This leads to their 4th principle, the sanctity of Mount Gerizim, not Jerusalem, as the one true place chosen by God for worship. They believe it was on Gerizim that Abraham prepared to sacrifice Isaac and that Joshua built the first Israelite altar upon entering the Promised Land. Finally, they believe in a day of vengeance and reward, an eschatological end time when a figure known as the Taheb, a prophet like Moses, will arise to restore true worship and bring about a final judgment. For thousands of years, the Samaritans have maintained their unique identity and religious practices, often in the face of intense persecution from Romans, Byzantines, Muslims, and Crusaders. They have continued to offer the Passover sacrifice, a lamb slaughtered and roasted according to ancient biblical prescriptions, on the slopes of Mount Gerizim every year, a ritual that the Jewish people ceased after the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem. Their community, which once numbered over 1 million in Roman times, has dwindled to a tiny remnant of less than 1,000 people today. Yet they have survived. They are a living, breathing link to the ancient northern kingdom. Their existence poses a profound challenge to the very concept of the lost tribes. Perhaps the answer to what happened to them is not to be found in the distant mountains of Afghanistan or the jungles of the Amazon, but right there in the heart of the Holy Land itself. Perhaps at least a portion of the tribes of Joseph were never truly lost at all, but were simply defeated, marginalized, and written out of the dominant historical narrative by their more powerful southern brethren. The Samaritans force us to consider the possibility that we have been searching for something that was never entirely gone, a people who have been hiding in plain sight for 2,700 years. The ancient mystery of the lost tribes is not merely a subject of theological speculation or historical debate. It has profound and tangible implications in the context of modern geopolitics and the contemporary state of Israel. The very foundation of the modern Zionist movement and the establishment of Israel in 1948 are rooted in the biblical concept of kibbutz galuyot, the ingathering of the exiles. This ancient prophetic hope, the dream of the Jewish people's return to their ancestral homeland after centuries of dispersion, has been a driving force of Israeli policy since its inception. The law of return, one of Israel's foundational laws, grants any Jew the right to come to Israel and receive citizenship. This policy has led to the immigration, or aliyah, of millions of Jews from every corner of the globe, from Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, North America, and the former Soviet Union. Historically, this ingathering has focused almost exclusively on the exiles of the southern kingdom of Judah, that is, the Jewish people who were scattered in the Babylonian exile and, more significantly, in the great diaspora following the Roman destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. The question of the 10 northern tribes was largely considered a matter for the distant, messianic future, not a practical issue of contemporary policy. However, in recent decades, this has begun to change. The persistent claims of various communities around the world to be descendants of the lost tribes have forced the Israeli state and its religious authorities to grapple with this ancient mystery in very concrete ways, with life-altering consequences for the people involved. The most prominent example is the case of the Beta Israel of Ethiopia. After years of debate about their origins, Israel's chief rabbinate in 1973 officially recognized them as descendants of the tribe of Dan, a decision that was later affirmed by the Israeli government. This ruling declared them to be eligible for citizenship under the law of return and led to the dramatic airlifts of the 1980s and 90s that brought tens of thousands of Ethiopian Jews to Israel. While their integration into Israeli society has faced challenges, their story represents a momentous, state-sanctioned discovery and ingathering of a community believed to be a lost tribe. More recently, the case of the Bni Meenashi of northeastern India has presented a similar challenge. Their passionate adherence to their tradition of descent from the tribe of Manasseh, coupled with their adoption of Orthodox Jewish practice, led them to seek recognition and the right to immigrate to Israel. After years of lobbying and rabbinic investigation, in 2005, a chief rabbi of Israel recognized their claim of Jewish ancestry, opening the door for their aliyah. Since then, several thousand members of the community have moved to Israel, with others hoping to follow. These cases highlight the complex intersection of religion, identity, and statehood in modern Israel. The process is fraught with difficulty. It involves complex rabbinic rulings on Jewish status, DNA testing, and navigating the political and social sensitivities of immigration. For every group that is recognized, like the Beta Israel or the Bni Minishi, there are others like the Igbo of Nigeria or the Pashtun of Afghanistan, whose claims remain in a state of ambiguity. The modern state of Israel, therefore, finds itself in the extraordinary position of being an active participant in the 2,700-year-old search for the lost tribes. The question is no longer merely academic or eschatological. It is a matter of practical halakha, Jewish law, and government policy. It forces a nation founded on the principle of ingathering its exiles to continually define the very boundaries of who belongs to the family of Israel, and to decide whether the time has come to welcome home brothers who have been lost for millennia. Beyond the fascinating historical debates, the competing ethnic claims, and the complex theological frameworks, the enduring story of the lost tribes of Israel offers a profound and deeply personal metaphor for the human spiritual condition. Regardless of our ancestry, whether Jewish or Gentile, the narrative of a people exiled from their home, scattered in a foreign land, and struggling with a forgotten identity resonates with the universal experience of alienation and the longing for return. In this spiritual interpretation, we are all members of a lost tribe. The story begins not with the Assyrian exile, but with the primal exile from the Garden of Eden, the original homeland of perfect communion with the Creator. Humanity, in its rebellion, was scattered from its spiritual center, sent eastward to wander in a land of struggle and mortality. The story of the 10 tribes becomes a powerful allegory for this universal state of spiritual displacement. Like the northern tribes, we often find ourselves living in a far country, a world that is not our true home. We are driven by a desire for autonomy. We build our own kingdoms and our own idols, and we forget the covenant that gives us our true identity. We become absorbed by the cultures around us, adopting their values, speaking their language, and pursuing their transient goals. We assimilate into the spiritual Babylon of our age, and in the process, we lose our sense of who we truly are and to whom we truly belong. We become genealogically and spiritually lost, cut off from the memory of our sacred origin. The experience of this spiritual lostness manifests in a deep-seated sense of homesickness, a quiet ache for a place of belonging that this world can never fully satisfy. Like the exiles in Assyria, we are haunted by a faint, ancestral memory of a different reality, a promised land of peace and purpose. This sense of being an exile in our own lives, a stranger in a foreign land, is a fundamental part of the human experience. It is the root of our striving, our art, our religions, and our relentless search for meaning. From this perspective, the various theories about the tribe's fate can also be seen as metaphors for our own attempts to rediscover our lost identity. Some of us, like the adherents of the Arzareth legend, believe we can find our true home by journeying to a distant, utopian place, by creating a perfect community isolated from the corrupting influences of the world. Others, like the proponents of British Israelism, try to find our sacred identity in our national or ethnic heritage, baptizing our political and cultural achievements with divine significance. Still others simply assimilate, concluding that the memory of home is just a myth and that the only reality is the one we see around us. The biblical promise of a final ingathering of the exiles, therefore, transcends a specific historical or ethnic fulfillment. It becomes a universal promise of spiritual restoration. It is the good news that the loving Father, the unlost shepherd, has not forgotten his scattered children. He is actively seeking us out in the far countries of our own making. The journey of the lost tribes becomes a powerful symbol of our own spiritual journey, the painful reality of exile, the gradual loss of identity, the dawning memory of home, the arduous journey of return, and the ultimate hope of a joyous welcome into a reunited family. The story, then, is not just about them. It is about us. It is the story of every human soul that has ever felt lost and has dared to hope that there is a way back home. As we look to the future, the ultimate answer to the mystery of the lost tribes, from a biblical perspective, lies not in historical research or genetic testing, but in the realm of prophecy. While historians may reasonably conclude that the tribes assimilated and disappeared, the prophets of Israel paint a radically different picture of their final destiny. They speak with a unified voice of a future, eschatological event in which God Himself will intervene in history to gather and restore the entirety of His scattered people, healing the ancient breach between the two houses of Israel and ushering in an era of perfect unity and peace. This prophetic vision of the Great Reunion is one of the grandest and most hopeful themes in the Hebrew Bible. The prophet Isaiah speaks of a day when a root of Jesse, a messianic figure, will stand as a banner for the peoples, and on that day, the Lord will extend His hand a second time to recover the remnant of His people. He will raise a signal for the nations and will assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. Isaiah 11 verses 10 to 12. This is not just a return from a single exile, like the return from Babylon, but a comprehensive, global ingathering of both houses of Israel. Jeremiah describes this future restoration in terms of a new exodus, an event so spectacular that it will eclipse the memory of the original deliverance from Egypt. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when it will no longer be said, "As surely as the Lord lives, who brought the Israelites up out of Egypt," but it will be said, "As surely as the Lord lives, who brought the descendants of Israel up out of the land of the north and out of all the countries where He had banished them. Then they will live in their own land." Jeremiah 23 verses 7 to 8. This return will be accompanied by a profound spiritual renewal, the making of a new covenant in which God's law will be written on their hearts. The prophet Ezekiel's vision of the two sticks of Judah and Joseph becoming one in his hand is the definitive image of this reunification. It symbolizes the end of the long and bitter rivalry and the creation of a single, unified nation under one king, a Davidic king who will shepherd them forever. They will be cleansed from their idols, and God will establish His dwelling place, His sanctuary, among them forever. This restored, 12-tribed Israel is not just a political entity. It is the fulfillment of God's covenant purpose for His people, that they might be a light to the nations. This vision of a restored and unified Israel is carried forward into the New Testament, where it finds its ultimate expression in the final chapters of the book of Revelation. The vision of the New Jerusalem, the heavenly city that descends to earth at the consummation of history, is a vision of perfect and eternal unity. The city has 12 foundations, inscribed with the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb, and it has 12 gates, and on the gates are inscribed the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel. This powerful imagery signifies that in the ultimate reality of God's kingdom, the family is complete. There are no lost tribes. The entire covenant people, redeemed from both the old and new covenants, are present and accounted for, forming the very structure of the eternal city. From this prophetic vantage point, the question of what really happened to them in the 8th century BC becomes secondary. Their historical journey of assimilation and disappearance is seen as a temporary phase in a much larger, divinely orchestrated drama. Their true story does not end in the dust of Assyria, but in the glorious light of the New Jerusalem. The final answer to the mystery is not a historical discovery, but a theological promise. Their destiny is not to be found by archaeologists, but to be fulfilled by the Messiah at the end of the age. As we draw the threads of this ancient and complex story together, we are left with a tapestry woven from history, legend, theology, and hope. The search for a single, definitive answer to what really happened to the lost tribes of Israel ultimately leads to a position of profound intellectual humility. There is no simple solution, no single theory that can account for all the evidence and all the traditions. Instead, we must learn to hold several different kinds of truth in tension, acknowledging the validity of different perspectives, from the historical to the theological. From a strictly historical and archaeological standpoint, the conclusion is one of sober probability. The evidence strongly suggests that the 10 northern tribes, after being conquered and deported by the Assyrian Empire, followed the path of countless other ancient peoples who were victims of imperial policy. They were scattered, they were broken, and over the course of generations, the vast majority of them were absorbed into the surrounding cultures. They intermarried, adopted new languages and customs, and their distinct Israelite identity gradually faded into the rich and diverse genetic and cultural heritage of the peoples of the modern Middle East. In this sense, they are lost to history because they cease to exist as separate, identifiable nations. Their story is a testament to the powerful, relentless forces of empire and assimilation. At the same time, we must acknowledge the undeniable cultural and sociological reality of the traditions that have endured. The memory of the 10 tribes never disappeared. It became a powerful, living narrative that has shaped the identities of diverse communities across the globe for millennia. The Pashtun of Afghanistan, the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, the Bni Minashi of India, and many others have preserved traditions of Israelite descent that cannot be easily dismissed. While these traditions may not always stand up to the rigorous scrutiny of modern genetic science or historical verification, they represent a profound form of historical memory, a testament to the enduring power of a story to define a people. These traditions tell us that even if the tribes were lost to the historical record, they were not entirely lost to human memory. Theologically, the biblical narrative offers a completely different and overriding truth. From the perspective of the prophets of Israel, the tribes are neither assimilated beyond recovery nor hidden in a secret land. They are known, numbered, and remembered by a covenant-keeping God who has a plan for their future. The consistent and unwavering prophetic promise is one of an ultimate, eschatological restoration and reunification of all 12 tribes. In the divine economy, their scattering is a temporary condition, a long and painful chapter in a story that will ultimately conclude with a joyous family reunion. In this view, their current state of being lost is a human perception, not a divine reality. Synthesizing these perspectives, we arrive at a nuanced conclusion. Historically, the tribes likely disappeared through absorption. Culturally, their memory has given birth to a world of living traditions and identities. Theologically, their future is one of guaranteed restoration. There is no single right answer because the question is being asked on multiple levels. The historian, the cultural anthropologist, and the theologian will each arrive at a different and potentially valid conclusion. The mystery of the lost tribes, therefore, endures not because of a lack of evidence, but because of the richness and complexity of the story itself. It is a story that exists at the intersection of history and faith, of memory and hope, and it reminds us that the past is never truly past, and the final chapter has not yet been written. In the final analysis, our long journey through history, legend, and prophecy leads us to a profound and transformative conclusion. The ultimate answer to the enduring question, what really happened to the lost tribes of Israel, may have less to do with the fate of the scattered and more to do with the character of the one who seeks them. Perhaps our focus has been misplaced. We have been consumed with the mystery of the lost, peering into the mists of history, searching for clues on ancient maps, and trying to decipher faint genetic echoes. But the biblical narrative, from beginning to end, consistently shifts our gaze from the lost sheep to the searching shepherd. The story's deepest and most resonant truth is not about the tragedy of their disappearance, but about the relentless, unwavering, and pursuing love of a God who refuses to let any of his children remain permanently lost. The prophet Ezekiel, after speaking of the scattering of the flock of Israel, delivers a stunning message directly from God. For thus says the Lord God, Behold, I myself will search for my sheep and will seek them out. As a shepherd seeks out his flock when he is among his sheep that have been scattered, so will I seek out my sheep, and I will rescue them from all places where they have been scattered on a day of clouds and thick darkness. This is the heart of the matter. The initiative for restoration does not lie with the lost, it lies with the finder. Jesus of Nazareth picked up this powerful theme, identifying himself as the Good Shepherd who leaves the 99 safe in the fold to go out into the wilderness to search for the one lost sheep, and who, upon finding it, carries it home on his shoulders, rejoicing. He declared that his own mission was to seek and to save the lost. This reframes the entire story. The disappearance of the 10 tribes is not a story of an unsolved historical problem, but a grand illustration of the divine predicament, a family scattered, a flock dispersed. And the central actor in the drama is not the tribes themselves, but the God who is passionately and actively engaged in the work of gathering them back. From this perspective, their 2,700-year sojourn in the nations, their assimilation, their forgetting of their own identity, all of it happens under the watchful and patient eye of a God who is orchestrating a story far larger than they can comprehend. He has a purpose in their scattering, and he has a purpose in their eventual regathering. The ultimate truth, then, is that no one is ever truly lost to God. The tribes may be lost to the historical record, lost to their brother Judah, and even lost to themselves, having forgotten their own name and lineage. But they are not lost to their Creator. He knows them, he remembers his promises to them, and he is a God who moves heaven and earth to bring his children home. The enduring power of this ancient mystery, therefore, is not found in solving the puzzle of their whereabouts. It is found in the profound spiritual comfort of knowing that we worship a seeking God. The story of the lost tribes is our story. It is the story of a humanity that has wandered far from its source, that has been scattered by its own sin and brokenness. And it is the story of a divine love that will not rest until the family is complete, until the last lost sheep is safely in the fold, until the two sticks are made one in his hand. The music of that final, great reunion may still be in the future, but its melody is one of hope, a hope grounded not in our ability to find our way back, but in the unwavering faithfulness of the shepherd who has promised to come and find us.